Kia ora and welcome to Chapter 6. And in Chapter 6 we're looking at the implementation of the competencies. And we spoke about this a little bit briefly earlier on in one of our talks, but now we want to sort of really focus on this implementation process. Implementation of the competencies starts off with identity. Identity is our big gig in town. If we get identity right at the beginning, then the other competencies start to flow through quite comfortably. So generally speaking, we allocate sort of 6 months to identity. Now, 6 months out of a 12-month year, so if it's not going to be actually 6 months, it's going to be probably more like 3 by the time we get through other things. But we want to allocate a significant amount of time proportionately. So 50% of our time is going to be around identity to start with, because that's where we have to begin with, and that's what we have to establish. So identity is first. We'll then do 25% of our time around thinking and questioning, 12.5% of our time around managing self, 6% of our time around collaboration, and 3% of our time around connecting and reflecting. However, you need to be doing some connecting and reflecting when you're talking about identity. There'll be some aspects of thinking and questioning which will drift in as you're talking about identity. There'll be some aspects of managing self and collaboration that will also be in there. So it's not a straightforward process, but we want you to focus in particular on setting that foundational identity initially. All right. Now, each of the competencies have been unpacked from the whole framework, into these concept frameworks. So you'll see there's a list of concept frameworks, and we've tiered them into a group that are about understanding, another group around techniques, and another group around dispositions. Because what we want to see over time is, once we have some understanding, then we can apply some techniques to that to build capacity, and then they become dispositions. Now, we won't wait until they're in their later years in high school before we get to dispositions. We want dispositions down when they're quite young as well. So this is not a hierarchical thing in terms of age. It's just putting some understanding in place, one or two of the concept frameworks from the identity in the understanding section. Then you can go down and try one of the techniques. And then you can go down and see, well, has that become a disposition? And so each of these 3 tiers, as we move down, are dealt with quite differently. So if we unpack one of these concept frameworks, as you can see in the diagram, if we unpack that diagram, what we start to see is we've got across the top, we've got starting out, building confidence, connecting, understanding deeply, and predicting with confidence. Whenever we start with a new competency, we always start with starting out. If they've done this starting out before, we want a reflection and a refresher on that, but don't ignore it. Don't just go quickly, oh, we think we're up to understanding deeply. You need to always start with starting out. It doesn't matter how old they are. So starting out is not for 5-year-olds. Starting out is for everybody. If we're starting with these competencies, we start with starting out. So the first row across there is that sort of tiering of capacity building. The second is the concepts themselves, and each of the concepts have been unpacked into their variables, and we're trying to keep the number of variables to a minimum. 2. You've got to have one thing that affects another. And one way of thinking about variables is through this notion of cause and effect. So each of us is unique in different ways, all right? And the variables there are each of us, because we're all different, okay, is unique in different ways. There's unique aspects about us that make us who we are. So each person has a different set, cause and effect, okay, of different capabilities. Difference can be celebrated in many ways. We're all different ethnically, culturally, physically, intellectually. We're all different, okay? So difference in something, okay, is a variable, is celebrated in different ways, and we celebrate each of these things. And we need to get better, quite probably, at actually recognizing that all of these things are equitable in terms of how much celebration we should have around them, okay? We celebrate sport. Okay, that's fantastic. Do we celebrate drama as much? Do we celebrate the woman winning as much as the men winning? And so we have to look at those differences and how we celebrate them. So The second tier here is around the concepts themselves and unpacking this concept, this concept, this concept, this concept, and predicting with confidence. And that builds the concept framework of authenticity that embodies our uniqueness as a person. Okay? So the concept frameworks are in the red box, and then we unpack concept 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to build this one here, the concept framework in the end. Learners 7 years on seem to cope very, very well with the concept frameworks and the concepts themselves in the language we've got in that second tier down. But we've also put in some learner statements to give the educators a sort of a framework they can use for people with limited, some of the learners who have limited language ability because they're young, and as they move through they'll be able to sort of then start looking at the concept frameworks themselves and the concepts that we unpack from that. There are another two layers yet to go. One is the reflective assessment, and the assessment of the competencies we want to keep to an absolute minimum if we can. And so reflective assessment really is a simple complete this sentence. Okay, and then the prediction is actually taking that, okay, if I can predict that I will be able to do this because of this. Okay, and so the teacher might, or the educator might give a context, their peers might give a context that they haven't experienced before and say, can you predict what might happen here? Because being able to predict tells us how well they understand the concept itself. So each framework is married up in the same way, and the learning domains, which are coming out in 2018, the learning domains are in the same sort of frameworks as well. Concepts underpinned into learner statements, underpinned into reflective assessments and predictions, okay, underpin each of the competencies. So implementation of the competencies: identity, thinking and questioning, managing self, collaboration, reflection and connection. Those are the 5 competencies, and it'll be challenging work for you because this is something you haven't done before, and initially we're going to get the educator to push through this process, but eventually we want the learners to start taking agency over that process themselves, and we'll talk more about that later on. Okay, thank you very much. All the very best.